Welcome, Naveed. Really happy to be here having another discussion with you today. In our last discussion, we left off by going over the problems of sovereignty, anarchy, and the state of nature in international relations. What I took from that discussion was that international relations is a state-centric system, as you went as far as to say that state, or the sovereign state to be exact, is the building block for the present world order. Can you briefly explain what is meant by the category of state? Like, what is a state?
The state is a political entity or political community that is independent and self-governing, and whose institutions have the capacity to devise rules that are binding on the population within its territory. So in this sense, the state is one of the most important political organizations in modern politics, and also one of the most enduring ones. State has a monopoly over the use of force, is home to a system of bureaucracy, and is in charge of the provision of a number of public goods.
So what is the historical origin of the modern state or modern state system?
If I have to speak about one origin, the treaty or Peace of Westphalia, which was signed in 1648, should be acknowledged. The treaty ended the 30 Years' War, a continental war that devastated Europe between 1618 and 1648. The treaty is the midwife at the birth of the modern state system. Among other things, the Peace of Westphalia designated each European king an emperor in his own milieu, and therefore subordinate to papal or other authority. As a result of this watershed agreement, Europe would be transformed into a collection of independent states, each with an autonomous ruler, wielding what is called exclusive authority over all state territories and their inhabitants.
So you are suggesting that the birth of both the modern state and the principle of sovereignty go hand in hand, and both date back to the Treaty of Westphalia.
Yes, absolutely. It was with the aforementioned principle of exclusive authority that the sovereign norm of monopoly over the use of violence within the territorial boundaries of the state, that is, internal sovereignty, and the sovereign norm of non-intervention on the part of other sovereign states in another's internal affairs, that is, external sovereignty, emerged.
So during our previous conversation, you referred to Thomas Hobbes as the figure who is most pivotal so far as understanding the principle of sovereignty is concerned. How does Hobbes articulate sovereignty?
Hobbes, or Hobbesian thought, is central to understanding the ideological dimensions of what is called the Westphalian order. By Westphalian order is meant that international order populated by sovereign states that continues to exist to this day, and whose genesis dates back to 1648. This so-called Westphalian order legitimizes the view that the sovereign model established in 17th century Europe should define what international relations, in this case as a state-centric system, must be for all times, contexts, and places, you see. This becomes readily apparent once we take into account that the 1651 publication of Leviathan, which is Hobbes' major work and is where he takes up the analysis of state sovereignty, corresponds roughly with the advent of the Peace of Westphalia, which again came into being in 1648. This is not to claim that Hobbesian thought reflects the Westphalian order in its entirety. Rather, it's to suggest that it's a manifestation of the logic of that order, and above all, its principles and rationales.
And how does Hobbes come up with the principle of sovereignty?
Hobbes crafted Leviathan as a response to papal hegemony, the 30 Years' War, and the English Civil War. He's trying to provide a rationale as well as drive a solution for bringing to an end the civil, political, and religious wars that had tormented Europe ever since the birth of the Protestant Reformation. In arguing that civil power must trump religious authority, he rejects the normative and political justification of the institution of the papacy, particularly its traditional practice of meddling in the domestic affairs of European kingdoms. He wrote that the papacy is no other than the ghost of the deceased Roman Empire, sitting crowned upon the grave thereof. That kind of a language. As a corrective, Hobbes introduces the principle of non-intervention as a norm of political authority capable of stemming bloodshed. For him, the first step in conceiving such a norm lies in articulating a historically contingent understanding of human beings, predicated upon the postulation that the natural condition of men, as he called it, is a condition of war of everyone against everyone. So Hobbes views this as an example of what he calls a knowledge of fact. He also calls it absolute knowledge, which is a type of knowledge production that is restricted to sense, memory, and objectivism. The product of what the researcher, in this case him, sees, senses, and feels. And we know what he saw, sensed, and felt. Misery, war, and conflict was a fact of everyday life as he lived through one of the most brutal civil wars in human history and also a devastating continental war. Put differently, the absolute knowledge understood as knowledge of fact is not a product of any scientific preoccupation, but in actual experience of how certain people behaved. In this case, in a given time and in some geographical space within the distant past. Nonetheless, subscribing to absolute knowledge leads Hobbes to speak about human beings and their political environment in relation to what he calls state of nature, the same condition of war of everyone against everyone, when life is, according to him, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So he naturalizes or normalizes state sovereignty as that which can politically tame the nasty and brutish nature of human beings and the environment within which they operate. It is a most miserable knowledge construct because it normalizes the view that every man is every man's enemy. And because every man is every man's enemy after the killing of the first enemy, that man is again in the like danger of another enemy. It is within this infinite, insidious cycle that all human beings arrive upon and are locked in a state of no way out, basically. And despite the fact that the positions Hobbes takes as the ideologue of the concept of state sovereignty are far and away too geographically particularistic and really historically reductive, state sovereignty has ended up becoming the absolute eternal condition of human beings and therefore all states. That is to say, for all times, places, spaces, and contexts.
So how has the principle of state sovereignty been applied to international relations? And how does it enable a war-engendering practice of global politics?
While clearly particular to some people in some distant past, it is the Hobbesian knowledge of state sovereignty as an absolute principle, as an absolute condition that has come to be viewed and accepted as the true political condition of all human beings and all states. This is why the epithet Hobbesian is commonly used to reference the structure of global politics and the international system alike. The argument is that states behave and exhibit the same characteristics as do human beings in Hobbesian terms, as conflict-prone, nasty, self-interested, and brutish. In the absence of a global sovereign that can coordinate state relations or settle disputes among them, that is, in anarchy, states operate in a condition of war of every state against every other state. This is why we take it as given that among states, the state of nature is a state of war, or that the international state of nature, too, is a state of war. Kenneth Waltz, for example, speaks about this, or rather writes about it in his seminal work, Man, State, and War. This is a condition of a perpetual state of war where sovereign states are always waiting to fight each other. Put differently, the international state of nature is a state of war. So the state of war is the aspect of international relations that must always dominate. Therefore, it is war that makes state and state that makes war. So goes the argument.
That's such an interesting perspective you're sharing here, Navid. From how I've understood sovereignty in the past has been how a state is sort of able to do whatever it wants. It's independent. It's always been viewed as a positive thing for that state to have the freedom. But put in this light, it has clearly become a more significant problem. Perhaps when it was taken up by Hobbes, in the 16th century or 17th century, it may have led to some degree of peace, but now it seems to have become more of the disease than anything. A lot to think about, and I really appreciate you spending the time to sort of explain some of these concepts in more depth and to share some of these ideas, and hopefully we can continue this conversation.
Absolutely. It's good to be with you here.
Thank you, Navid.